The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the biggest battle between aircraft carriers in history. It happened from June 19 to 20, 1944, during the Pacific War. This one battle will determine whether Imperial Japan will rise or fall. Japanese Admiral Soimu Toyota wrote about the battle after the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet and the Imperial Japanese Navy's Mobile Fleet. The Fifth Fleet's defensive position remained tied to the islands for months after the battle ended. The American troops were finally bombing the Japanese mainland, a key move that would decide the outcome of the war. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army, driven by the country's eager imperialism, started planning an ambitious plan. Pearl Harbor was just the beginning of a plan to make U.S. troops suffer enough to start a peace process that would let Japan keep its conquests in the Pacific. Abrami-natured Kogi started making plans for a decisive battle in early 1944. However, Koga was killed in a typhoon, and Admiral Soimu Toyota was put in charge of putting the plans for Operation Eagle into action on June 12, 1944. As part of Operation Forager, carriers launched a powerful airstrike on the Mariana Islands. This caught the Japanese by surprise, and they weren't ready to counterattack because they only had 50 land-based aircraft to defend their position. After 3 days of airstrikes and surface bombardments, American troops finally landed on Saipan. Toyota knew it was time to put Plan Ego into action and use Kantaikasan, which means decisive battle. This strategy came about when a well-trained but smaller Japanese navy beat the Russian fleet at the start of the 20th century. During previous battles in the Pacific Theater in 1942 and 1943, the Japanese lost most of their skilled pilots. This loss could not be replaced, so their aircrew couldn't fill most carrier groups. Admiral Toyota still ordered a naval counterattack and sent almost all the Imperial Japanese Navy standing carriers to battle for sightings. Vice Admiral G. Saburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese First Mobile Fleet. Ozawa was sure the Japanese were ready to start the battle because they had a foolproof plan and the eastern trade winds were in their favor. U.S. Fifth Fleet Commander Raymond Ames Spence knew an attack was coming. On the afternoon of June 15, 2 American submarines found Japanese ships and reported back to command close to midnight. The USS Kabbalah submarine saw Ozawa's refueling convoy as the submarine went down 75 feet. After coming to the surface, the USS Kabbalah reported the encounter and was ordered to follow the convoy to find a possible refueling rendezvous. The submarine tracked the convoy for 3 days and found some of the Japanese fleet's positions. The American crew was told to stand and was disappointed not to fight. After consulting Admiral Chester Nimitz, Spruance sent Task Force 58 into the Philippine Sea. By midnight on June 18, Nimitz told Spruance that a Japanese ship had broken radio silence, and given its location, 355 miles southwest of the 58th position, Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell thought the Japanese might be using a well-known trick. Mitchell asked for permission to move west overnight and set up his task force for an air attack in the morning, worried that a Japanese diver might be in the area. Mitchell asked Spruance to do something, but Spruance said no. The crew was once again disappointed by the lack of action. Spruance was known for his offensive tactics in the 1942 Battle of Midway, but he thought, if we were doing something so important that it drew the enemy to us, we could let him come and take care of him when he got here. The Admiral's goal was clear: protect the invading American fleet and secure the territory. Destroying the Japanese fleet was not a priority, but they didn't know that. Despite the enemy's plans to fight a decisive frontal battle later that day, the U.S. Navy's sophisticated air control found bombers flying their way and sent combat air patrol fighters to intercept them. Search patrols then took off from Task Force 58, and battleships and cruisers got ready to fight any attackers with destructive barrages of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire before they could reach the aircraft carriers for raids at 5:50 a.m. On June 19, Task Force 58 came across a Mitsubishi A6M0. The Japanese plane attacked but was quickly shot down. Before it crashed into the Pacific, though, it was able to radio the location of the U.S. forces. Soon after, U.S. forces saw an enemy air formation coming their way. At a rotating field, 30 Grumman F-6F Hellcats were sent to meet the attackers, and a fight broke out even as the Japanese sent more planes from nearby islands. 2 hours later, the USS Albacore was the only American plane to survive. Torpedoed by Admiral Ozawa's flagship, Taiho. Four torpedoes went off course, and a fifth was about to hit the submarine when pilot Saiko Komatsu saw the bubble path and dove into it, causing a detonation. However, despite the officer's sacrifice, a sixth and final torpedo hit the vessel's fuel tanks, and gas vapors filled the hangar decks as the albacore took them and the other 68 Japanese planes 10 minutes to get back together. In that time, the Hellcats intercepted them, and within minutes, only 27 Japanese planes were still flying. Those who managed to avoid the Hellcats tried to attack nearby U.S. destroyers, but only the USS South Dakota was hit by a bomb, but it wasn't enough to disable her. The USS South Dakota was the only American ship to 6 planes made it to the Enterprise and Princeton carriers and attacked them. There were some casualties, but no serious damage. At noon, the USS Kabbalah got ready to attack the Shikoku carrier. 3 of the 6 torpedoes hit starboard, where the planes were refueling. This caused an explosion that set off more ammunition and bombs. Fuel vapors built up between the decks, which blew the ship up. The American screen stopped a third raid at 1 p.m., 50 miles to the north. Several attackers who got through the defense tried but failed to hit American ships. This time, 40 out of 47 Japanese fighters returned safely to their carriers. A fourth raid was given the wrong position, so the Americans couldn't find them. They split into 2 groups and went to Rota and Guam to refuel. The first group ran into an American task group and an English one. The second group was stopped by 27 Hellcats as they tried to land on Guam on the Japanese Tahoe. An inexperienced officer tried to ventilate the ship, but the vapors filled it up. A spark then set off the fumes in the electric generator, which caused 2 explosions that sank the warship on the first day of combat. The Japanese lost over 10 times as many planes as the Americans, but the battle wasn't over yet. Vice Admiral Ozawa heard about the bad news from the day before. He only had 150 planes, but he thought there were many more still in Guam and Rota, so he went ahead with the attack. Meanwhile, Task Force 58, patrols, and midday Hellcat groups were trying to find their opponents. Finally, at 3:12 p.m., a search plane spotted a possible group of vessels. 32 minutes later, the sighting was confirmed, and the Japanese fleet, even though it was getting dark, a message came through saying that the Japanese location was wrong and that they were 60 miles away from where they were thought to be. This meant that the pilots would have to fly back in the dark with very little fuel. 54 Avenger torpedo bombers and 77 dive bombers reached the Japanese forces before sunset and attacked only 35 enemy fighters. A strike group went straight for the Japanese oilers and severely damaged 2 of them. Bombs and torpedoes set the carrier on fire. Hyo on fire and put it down. Bombs also hit 3 other carriers on the battleship. Only 20 U.S. planes were destroyed, and the rest started heading back in the middle of the night. Their fuel levels were dangerously low, and many of them had to ditch into the dark sea in a last-ditch effort to help their fellow pilots. The entire U.S. fleet shone searchlights into the sky and lit up the scene, even though it put them at risk of being seen by enemy submarines or search planes. Even the destroyers fired star shells. As a result, a total of 80 planes from the returning group were lost. Search efforts were able to save about 3/4 of them. The next day, after repeated defeats, Admiral Toyota ordered Ozawa to withdraw. The Japanese had suffered crippling losses, including 3 carriers and about 550 planes in 2 days. The Americans had destroyed most of the forces that had taken almost a year to rebuild after the defeat in the Coral Sea. From what the public knew, the Americans lost about 100 planes and no ships. The Japanese forces were severely weakened by Admiral Bruin's strategy, and they never recovered from their losses. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese heavily relied on kamikaze pilots in a desperate attempt to end the war without surrendering. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot after a Lexington pilot who yelled,